So thank you, Steve. I think that's the nicest welcome I've had in a very long time anyway, so thank you very much for that. I'm really grateful for the welcome. I'm really grateful for the chance to be here and to share this fabulous piece of art. It's going to be a fairly flexible evening. I'm going to make sure that we end at about 8:30 as promised. But this is about enjoying things, and particularly enjoying this fabulous piece of art. I'm a huge fan of art in church. I think it's really important. I think it's part of our response to our Creator God with all of our own skills and abilities. And I'm also convinced that we can make good use of the art that we've got in our churches. It was put there to help us think about God and to help us think about our Christian faith. And those of us who preach and teach need to have confidence to use the artwork in our preaching and our teaching. Because most churches, not just this church, but most churches will have artwork in them somewhere, even if it's only a display of children's pictures on a notice board or an old banner that's kind of hanging slightly askew on a pillar or something. Some churches and cathedrals have some significant pieces of art made by world-renowned artists, and here at St James there's this historically really significant piece of art. There are only 5 Doom boards in the country, and this is one of them. And in a moment, Christopher's going to tell us about what we know about this one. But just to spoil some of that, there's quite a lot we don't know. We don't know who painted it, and we're not entirely sure when it was painted. But it's massively striking, and it's hugely important. I think, Christopher, now is the time. I will hand over to you, and you can talk us through how this came to be in such good repair.
Is the filming finished, or do you
I think it's ongoing, so
it's
I think
ongoing.
you're being
Good.
filmed.
Well, the Doom board that you see above is a very different Doom board to the one that I knew some 35 years ago, which was erected at the back of the church, and it was too wide to go on one wall, so it actually turned the corner towards the north window, and it was really not visible as to what it was portraying at all. I think we knew that it was the portrayal of the Last Judgment, but we didn't know very much more than that. As Simon alluded, there are only 5 known Doom boards. There are plenty of murals which are mainly fairly poor condition now of the Last Judgment painted on the walls, but 5 Dooms, one in Suffolk, one at Penn in Buckinghamshire, this one in Herefordshire, and one elsewhere, I can't remember. Gloucestershire, it is, that's right. Newton, I think, will do some of that. So the original position, we think, was where it is mounted now, but we can't be certain. And it is said that the rood screen, or tympanum as it's known, was higher, and it was cut down and rebuilt with a new lower section in the 17th century. And the 3 coats of arms which you see there belong to the Danvers family. So the painting is, as I said, depicting the Last Judgment, and it would have reminded the mainly illiterate villagers of the penalties of sin and the benefits of holiness. We had a very large painting at the back of the church, which was the Mass with the Innocents, by a famous Italian artist, and that paid for a new roof, and there was a little bit of money over, which initiated the idea of having the Doom board restored. Painting at the back was absolutely vast, and was thought to have come out of Dauntsey Park House. Anyway, it was sold at auction, and in about 1987 or 8, and made quite a lot of money. And that really sort of got us going thinking about restoring the Doom board. English Heritage then started to take an interest, and we submitted a grant application, and in the end I think we achieved roughly an 80% grant. 75% was the sort of standard with English Heritage, but anyway, we achieved 80%, and we then obtained grants from various other bodies, such as the Wiltshire Historic Churches Trust, and various family trusts, and the Sainsbury Trust, and so on. So it more or less covered the cost of the restoration work, which was in the order of £140,000, and this was in the early 1990s. So if you then equate that to today's money, well, probably double. English Heritage took a great interest, and we had a lot of visits from it and discussions, and in the end it was agreed that it would go up to Norfolk, a place called Saxthorpe, in the middle of Norfolk, and would be restored there. The boards themselves were dated by a specialist to the late 14th century, which is a little bit earlier than the painting, which is thought to be 15th century, and we believe it to be the third painting on those boards. There are a couple of missing boards, and you can see there from there. There is no painting depiction at all, and that's just been coloured in to match. And the horizontal bar across is one of these cross beams, as in where the lights are mounted, and that's been plastered and then again painted in. And then on the top of the Doom Board there is further plaster and painting, and that is late 20th century painting when the Doom Board was erected here, with the idea that it's clouds and those going up to heaven can then go on up through. That was done as the last part of the project, and that was on advice actually of the painting specialist from Bristol. We cut English Heritage out of that discussion completely, and I think there's a little bit of turquoise left, but anyway, we got away with it. There was also a discussion about how to frame it and to enclose the back so that from the chancel it looked visually acceptable, and so it has been boxed in, and then we chose some variable colours to match the stone wall. It does have the disadvantage that for services, unless you're sitting in the choir, the organ acoustics are not nearly as good as they should be or could be. And that's another story. We have other possible plans there. So the restoration has been a great success in my view. The colours are bright, they were hardly visible at all. I went up to Norfolk to see the Doom Board in pieces, which was really rather extraordinary. And they took, I think it was nearly 10 years from when it was taken out of the church to when we actually got it back and re-erected. And at the same time, up in Saxthorpe, we took the Royal Coat of Arms above the north door, because that was very, very dirty and gloomy, and we couldn't really tell whether that was George II, George III, or whatever. And so that went in the van as well at the same time. We'd already had there was a Peterborough coat of arms above the south door, restored in Bristol, and we were very pleased with that. And so it was an opportunity there, because that used to be mounted up near the Downers tomb, and you couldn't see it from the main body of the church. So we re-erected that there, and then the two were complementary over the north and south doors. So that's a bit of background about the Doom. It was, we imagine, taken out of the church during the time of the Reformation and stored. Nobody quite knows whether it was stored in Dauntsey Park House. There was a local legend it was stored under the floor there, but that would be quite impossible with a solid stone floor and the water table. There was also mentioned at one point in Victorian times that it was taken to Chippenham Museum. But again, I don't think there's any documentary evidence of that. So we did have the idea possibly of erecting it over the radar screen straight ahead at the west end, and so we made up a template to see what that would look like and whether it would take too much light away from that area, because it would more or less block off the light from the west window. And so that was a sort of an option. We went for what we thought was probably the original position. I think we'll probably agree that it's the best position. So what I thought I'd just do now is just read out the description which is available of the story of the Doom, so you can just follow it, and then you can have a long study of it yourselves and discuss it between yourselves. So it must have been a pride and joy, actually, of Dauntsey Church when it was first painted. And, it's painted on boards which are shaped to fit under the chancel arch. I suspect it's elm boards rather than oak. At the top, an arc of clouds painted in pale grey defines the space and the events of the last day are narrated below. At the extreme left, in the upper part of the painting, a glorious jumble of medieval architecture delineates the apartments of heaven, imagined here as an ecclesiastical building with mullioned windows and turrets. An angel, very hard to see against the wealth of building detail, sounds one of the trumpets of doom. St. Peter in a red robe stands in the wide gateway to welcome three small naked people into the heavenly realm. Moving to the right, the judging Christ sits on a rainbow as usual, the crescent moon, along with another barely visible trumpeting angel in red, beside him at his left. He has the three-lobed halo appropriate to the Trinity and holds up his still bleeding arms to show his wounds. Directly below Christ, the Virgin Mary kneels, hands held out in supplication for the rising souls. A flat board divides the painting at this point, and on the right-hand side of it kneels John the Evangelist, or possibly John the Baptist. It is hard to be sure. In a similarly supplicating attitude to the Virgin, with the raised sun above at the top of this tier of painting. Standing figures in red flank both the Virgin and St. John, and both seem to be singled out as particularly significant. Who they are, though, is well nigh impossible to guess now. Two much clearer angels are visible on this side, one also sounding a trumpet, and a crowd of rising souls. Some, I think, with mitres cluster around, although it's very hard to distinguish. Further to the right, an angel brandishes a threatening sword above two small naked figures. And finally comes an unpleasant black devil who blows a horn and may be pulling another by the arm. These people seem undoubtedly destined for hell. Directly below is the mouth of hell itself, shown in the traditional manner as the toothed mouth of a whale-like sea creature. One huge eye also showing. You can detect a few dismembered body parts inside the mouth, which would not be surprising. Two red devils, one above and one below, are about to secure a chain around a group of people, three of them visible, with others probably empowered, whose final destination this is. Moving back to the left, three shrouded corpses, their shrouds knotted on top of the head in the standard medieval manner, are visible against the rather murky background. Further left, four naked figures make their way along an ascended path in the direction of St. Peter above, and at the furthest left are two more still shrouded souls. So all in all, the Dauntsey Doom, it's a fine example of how English people thought about death, hell, heaven and judgment in the latter part of the 15th century. So that gives you a little summary and plenty to think about. I think that's really all I've got to say.
Bishop, that's really fabulous. Thank you so much.
Well, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Gives you food for thought.
Just very briefly, if anyone's got questions that you might be able to answer, do ask them now.
You said the boards were it was very hard to see the detail of the boards before they were restored. And then obviously there must have been a moment when you saw the first version after restoration. How were you feeling when you saw that?
I think the word wow came to mind. You can see 2 or 3 of the boards have been on the visit that I made had been restored, and the others were there. So you have the contrast of the before and after.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, excuse me, I've got to slip on to something else.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful and really great.
The rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Okay, can I just ask a question?
You can.
Why do you think that in this Christian period of painting, there's no reference here to the cross?
That's a brilliant question. I'm going to ask you to hang on to that. Because what I want us to do now for a bit is to just spend some time looking at it. And to ask 2 questions. The first question that I want you to ask is, what would it be like to pray in front of this piece of art each week for many years? Now, I'm well aware that I wonder, Steve, if you could get to the light control and you can demonstrate just how low you can light this and how high, so that you can see that it's not always lit so that it can be seen. So you might want to think a bit about why that is.
I'll just adjust the video for the benefit of...
Yeah, sure. What would it be like to pray with this as the backdrop to your prayers? And the second question, and this is why your question about the cross, I wanted to hold on to that, because I think that's really profound. What does it say about God and about Christian faith? Please don't self-censor. There are no wrong answers, there are no daft answers. Just what does it say to you about God or about Christian faith? So hold those 2 questions. Do feel free to move around if you want to look at it up close or take a view from the back or get it at an angle. Do move about. Just what does it mean to, what would it be like to pray in front of this? What does it say about God and about our Christian faith? And I will bring us back together in about 10, 15 minutes maybe. Great. Off we go. Move forward, Barry. Yeah. Well, what's it like to pray in front of something like this for a long period of time?
We said terrifying.
Terrifying. I was hoping someone would say that. Terrifying. Yeah, thank you.
Think twice before misbehaving.
Okay, so thinking twice before you misbehave. So there's something there about, there's actually a power going on in this painting. It's trying to, influence you. It's trying to push you in a particular direction. Anything else?
Control, mind control.
Mind control. Yeah, okay.
If you don't do what you're told, then you know exactly what's going to happen to you. But if you do, then you've got so much to look forward to.
Okay. Thank you.
It's very severe.
Severe, yes, it is.
Not much sign of mercy or grace or love portrayed there.
Not much mercy, love or grace.
But I think you start to see that though, the mercy, love and grace, with I know it's not a particularly handsome portrait of Jesus at the top, but his arms are raised in blessing, and there are the two figures, Mary and John, below him, interceding. So I think there is mercy, love and grace in there. And actually they're much more prominent in the composition of the painting than the scary head in the corner.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I wondered whether it could be arms of blessing, yes, but I wonder whether it's arms of welcome too, in a way. And the arms have got the wounds, you know, the nail prints, the wounds he suffered for us.
Wounds of love.
And saying, look, I've done this for you, I'm welcoming you. Are you coming this way?
I think that's really helpful, and I love that kind of equation of blessing and welcome. I think that's a really helpful and interesting equation.
And somebody did say earlier that there was no reference to the cross, but in those raised arms with the pierced hands, there is.
Okay, I promise you, we are going to come back to the cross. I'm going to ask Steve to say something about that, and I will come back with something on that as well. I do promise you we will get there.
To pray in front of it for a long time would, for me, be to be reminded of how we are in the midst of, in life we're in the midst of death, and death, you know, that this is the reality of the people of the time, was death was ever present. And this is reflecting that, I suppose. What strikes me is the serenity of the people on the right, going into the mouths of hell. They don't seem bothered. Well,
The two on the left of the three do look like they're smiling going into the mouth of hell. It's quite cheery.
And up above, they're not kind of fighting back or being, you know.
It's too late to fight back.
Right.
Acceptance. I find it interesting that all the figures on the left-hand side have their hands in prayer, compared to the ones that are, well, they're not disturbed going into the mouth of hell. I think that's just my natural instinct, because I've just spent the last 10 minutes now on the floor in front of it. My natural instinct is to want to fall on my face in prayer. It feels like it draws me to pray. It feels like if I stayed here for a long time, I wouldn't find it hard. Actually, I think my natural impulse looking at this is to fall on my face in prayer.
Okay, thank you. And what does this say to us about God or about Christian faith? I think we've covered quite a lot of that already, but is there anything else that we want to say?
It's Peter there welcoming them into. They're naked, they've got nothing with them, they're bringing nothing from earth at all, but just themselves, being welcomed in. And one assumes that you can't see what's happening beyond that point, but they're expecting to be dressed as the others in heaven are dressed. The angels, Mary, St. John.
Got nothing into the world and we take nothing out of the world. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Many funeral services begin. Steve, will you tell us a bit about the cross?
Yeah, okay, hang on. I'll just come up there so whoever's watching this can see the face that's talking.
There are traces of a cross there. If you look in the middle at the top, one of the missing things that's been filled in artistically, Jesus' left foot is missing, and looking to the other side, underneath the angel, it seemingly appears out of nothing. You can start to see where there might have been the rude cross. And that would have put Mary and John underneath the arms of the cross, as they typically would be depicted on a rude screen. So that's potentially why those areas of the painting are missing. And that's bit speculative. I was here a few weeks ago, and the architect who supervised the project was here giving a talk to students, so I learned an awful lot from him that day. And I understand we do have a small wooden cross, probably about 2 foot high. And I do understand that at the time when it used to stand on the top of this screen, that when the board was put back in, perhaps it was English Heritage who wouldn't let us put the cross back in front of this amazing work of art. So, okay, we have to rely on the fact that we've got a cross stood on the altar rather than the one being in front of the painting itself. And I can kind of see that. You want to be able to see the artwork. You know, I thought, well, maybe do we want to hang a cross, suspend a cross in front of this being here, but then that would block the view of the painting. So I can see that, but it is a bit odd that we can't put a cross somewhere in such a prominent position.
Thank you, Steve.
Do you want to know a bit about how I use it to preach, or we
I would love to hear about it. Can we finish the cross, and then I'm going to ask you how you use it to preach.
Can I
So-
throw something in about the cross? I've spent some time in the Middle East, Turkey and Greece, and in the Cappadocia you've got the underground churches, and I'm just trying to remember, I think a lot of the paintings there don't have crosses in them. I'm just trying to visualise what I've seen, and I think the cross wasn't there. You find Jesus, and in the Byzantine churches, of course, you often find Jesus in the top of the dome, looking down on you, but no cross.
So, the figure of Mary and John, and with all respect to Christopher, it's almost certainly St. John the Apostle, because those were the two figures that would stand either side of a rood cross, and rood, we have a rood screen, and we talk about a rood, and rood is simply Old English for cross. So they would be either side of the cross. Whether or not there was one there, as Steve says, I suspect is going to remain a matter of speculation. But clearly, if you put those two figures there, it would signify cross. Jesus bearing the wounds, which is some of us were in Southmead a week ago in Bristol looking at the Ascension Reredos there, which is a very different piece of art. It's a 20th century iron sculpture with huge great wounds in the hands and feet and side. Although this has got a very kind of medieval aesthetic with the blood dripping down Jesus' arms. That's not quite, I think, the way the fourth gospel describes it. So there is quite a lot of cross there or assumed, but you're absolutely right to point out it's the glaring absence.
But one of the reasons why Jesus himself looks strange and out of proportion is I think he's seated. He is the risen and ascended Lord.
Absolutely.
And so he is seated. So, you know, the cross is history.
Yeah. And he's seated on a rainbow, which is a nice thing.
Is the rainbow is that part of the iconography of the time? Because I've never been aware of it before, but there's so much that you always see, like Peter's Keys.
So the rainbow as a piece of iconography is partly a reference to God's covenant with the world, but mostly it's actually just a sign that Jesus is beyond the world.
Right.
And so if you see around Jesus, you've got the moon to the left of Jesus and the sun to the right of Jesus just above the angel-blown trumpet, and there are stars in there. Jesus is sat above the whole world, and this is the judgment throne.
Yeah, I was just asking more about whether this is those particular images recur in artworks of the time.
One of the things that the rainbow signifies is that you do find it's not as universal as Peter with his keys and things like that, but it is a sign of, particularly Jesus seated on a rainbow is a sign of Jesus above the world in judgment.
So we would see it elsewhere.
So you would see it elsewhere. Steve, tell us how you use this to preach, because I think this is a fascinating thing to preach with.
So you're looking at the Doom Board with the lighting on full. It's not in what we call conservation settings, so normally the lighting is lower than this. If we've accidentally put it on full, you will find that just naturally the eye is drawn to that rather than anything that's happening down here. Now, occasionally you'll take advantage of that if you want to speak about it. So I don't speak about it every single time I'm preaching it, but there are times when it just leads perfectly to what I'm trying to say. Possibly not all the time to make reference to it. But I did make use of it at a wedding we had on Saturday. Somehow, part of the passage they didn't realise they'd chosen. They mistyped in their order of service a passage, and I looked at it and went, that's not a very wedding-y passage, but it does make reference to the Doom Board. So, or to the judgment, so I'm going to keep it in, and I managed to link it into the lifelong promises you're making, and at the end of your life, as it says several times in the wedding service, you're going to die. And you're going to be invited to a heavenly banquet. Oh look, we've got one of those up there. So I linked it in on that occasion, but it's something we will use from time to time as we are preaching in this church. So it's quite a handy visual aid. Just one that you can't switch off.
But you can lower the lights.
But I can lower the lighting.
Thank you. So I want to say a few things about what the Doom Board says about Christian theology. And it's very clear, and Christopher alluded to this, that the Advent themes of the four last things, death, judgment, heaven and hell, are what this Doom Board is focusing on. And I'll say something about each in turn. What's interesting in the four last things is that they make no reference to resurrection, which is a fairly fundamental Christian belief about the end of time and the end of things. I think there is resurrection on this board. I think partly it's as you move from the shrouded corpses into the figures on the path. That's a kind of resurrection going on. And there's also resurrection hiding in the most unexpected place in this. But we'll start with the first of the four last things, which is death. And pretty much everything that the Doom Board depicts is after death. Even Jesus has died. It's the journey of the soul after death, with those pathways that are depicted, and the different souls in different places. Now you might recall Dante's Divine Comedy, in which Dante describes the journey of a soul who looks at hell and purgatory and then finally heaven. And this is coming from a similar period to Dante. This, however, is I can only really describe this as a proto-Protestant Doom Board, in that there's no purgatory that I can see. But there is still that sense of the soul travelling after death towards heaven or hell. And Steve, I'm not sure I want you taking my wedding, but that sense of the inevitability of death is very much what this board is saying. So then we move to judgment. And in a really important sense, the board is nothing but judgment. The travelling souls are moving towards one or other destination, depending on how they've been judged. Judgment is not a theme that we like to think about. We find it troubling and frightening. My kids will often say, "Don't judge me." And the church has a really bad reputation for being judgmental. Judgment is a bad thing, capital B, capital T. is, in the Bible, the judgment of God is quite good news. The Psalms are full of pleas for God to get on and judge the world, because then God will judge the wicked and judge in favour of the righteous. So Psalm 7 has the psalmist asking God, "Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity that is in me." Use a bit more of that at the moment. Judgment in the Psalms is about how God reveals God's self to the nations, to the wicked. They encounter God in judgment. And here we have Jesus sitting in judgment. And the rainbow at his feet, as we've said, is a sign that Jesus is above the world, and he is definitely seated. He's on the judgment throne. He's seated at the right hand of God and judging the world. And the angels are blowing the trumpets, which in the book of Revelation herald the judgment. And what I love about this doom board is you have an answering trumpet from the devil, from the demon on the bottom right, blowing. It's almost blowing a raspberry in return. The book of Revelation makes no reference to demons blowing trumpets, but this is also good news, because at the top right, the two figures, those are Adam and Eve. They've been thrown out of paradise, and then the angel with the flaming sword. So you have the angel with the trumpet, and then the next angel has a sword. And the angel with the flaming sword is to keep Adam and Eve out of paradise. They've been thrown out, and the angel with the flaming sword is put in place to keep them out. Unless you watch Good Omens, when he gives them the sword, because they look a bit cold. That's the moment in the Bible where everything begins to go wrong. It's where sin gets its foothold in the world. It starts with Adam and Eve. Their next story is their children, which is when we have the first murder. And then those beginning chapters of the book of Genesis, after Adam and Eve, things just get ramped up. It gets worse and worse and worse. And it was that Jesus came to deal with. So Jesus is described by St. Paul as the second Adam. And the second Adam does not bring death, but brings life. And it is the cross, missing, perhaps, or not, but it is on the cross that Adam's sin is dealt with, and we are all given the opportunity to live. And the New Testament accounts of the judgment of God see that the judgment of God is fulfilled in the cross of Jesus. And so judgment is no longer something to fear. There's a different aesthetic, I think, between us and our medieval ancestors, which is where the blood comes all over Jesus' arms, and they like that kind of gore. We reserve that for horror films. But this is about judgment as something that is not to be feared. So I wonder how we might allow the Doom Board to help us to think more positively about judgment. God's judgment is for us because we are found in Christ. So death and judgment, and then for the righteous there is heaven. I want to say two things about the depiction of heaven in the painting. And the first is, actually it's not that interesting. We get a bit of heaven shown, and it's a bit of a big house. I mean, it's probably in that sense of, in my Father's house there are many mansions, from St. John's Gospel, chapter 14. But if you think of the artistic imagination, I think more imagination has been poured into the bottom right-hand corner than to the top left-hand corner. Heaven it looks a bit dull. Now, William Blake, who was the 18th century painter, engraver and poet, to whom we owe the lyrics to Jerusalem, Blake was really critical of John Milton's reworking of Dante's Divine Comedy in Paradise Lost. Milton depicts Satan as kind of a bit misunderstood, and there's quite a lot of inward agony going on inside Satan. And Blake said that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, largely because he gave the devil all the best lines and he made Satan the best character. And I think there's an artistic challenge here. And it's not just in painting, we find it in novels and in all kinds of art. And the challenge is to make virtue, and hence heaven, interesting. Because virtue ought to be interesting. Heaven, hell and sin and is largely banal. Hannah Arendt, who watched the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and who would be one of the kind of leaders, he'd run a concentration camp and had systematically been wiping out Jewish people in the camp. So she watched his trial and said that what was remarkable was the banality of evil. That it was just about production lines and checklists, and there was nothing exciting about it. It was just getting a day's work done. It was dull. But in our art, we tend to make murder really exciting. Actually, that's simply not true. Most murder is done by, within close relationships, and it's really tragic, but it's quite banal. Few have achieved this, but do look, where are places in art of any description where virtue is made interesting and exciting? And the other thing I noticed about heaven on this Doom Board is that it's a big house. And next to this church is another big house. So I wonder about the power dynamics that are going on here. Heaven is the seat of God. It's where St. Peter, who's exercising the power of the keys, deciding who is and who is not allowed in. Do we have a portrait of the Lord of the Manor here as a kind of, first of all, the Lord of the Manor is a certainty for heaven. And secondly, perhaps he shares something of St. Peter's powers of deciding who can and who can't come in. I don't know. Similarly, let's not make this just about the Lord of the Manor. This could be about the church building. And the church wanting to have the power of who gets in and who doesn't. But we don't. That's the judgment is Christ's judgment. It's not the church's judgment. It's not my judgment. So there is a power thing going on here, and I just wonder whether that building might be a clue to some of that. I don't know. And then finally, to hell. It's the last of the four last things. There's something playful about hell in this Doom Board. That smiling mouth with sharp teeth and fiery breath. If you look closely, I think there are kind of 2 feet of the last person who's been thrown in. You can just see them on their way down. And the devil's attaching chains. This is a binding fate. There's no way out of this. That's why I think this has had so much of the artistic imagination put into it. Clearly, I think the artist has had a lot of fun here. But it's worth spending a little time on that imagery for hell. It's a mouth with lots of teeth. We often speak of the mouth of hell. Even Buffy the Vampire Slayer lived over a hell mouth, for those who watch such things. I just happen to know that Steve does. The mouth, and the teeth especially, are really important, because the medieval view of hell emphasised the way that in hell people were ground up and scattered. It was part of what made hell final, with lots of small bits all over the place. Putting people back together again would be impossible. So a contemporary image for the hellmouth might be hell as a shredder. And there were all kinds of medieval arguments that go on with this. Not least in one medieval theologian arguing that in cannibalism, which is exactly somebody else's body being made part of my body as I digest them, that actually the material from somebody else's body could not become part of my body, because otherwise what would happen at the end when God was separating people and restoring people? And this is where we get that indirect but clear reference to resurrection. And it's precisely because medieval Christians believed in resurrection in a very material way, about putting bodies back together, that hell is depicted as grinding bodies up and turning them into little bits, which then can't be put back together. Grinding and chewing us up into small pieces is the greatest threat, precisely because wholeness and an intact body is the promised gift of resurrection. The Doom Board that we're looking at is a very good Advent sermon. It gives us insights into those four last things of death, judgment, heaven, and hell. I first looked at this, other than some pictures online, a week ago. So I'm sure as I look at it again and look at it more will come out. More has come out as we've talked tonight, and I've been really grateful for that. There have been some really good insights. Our journeys have not yet reached the path at the bottom left-hand corner of the picture. So actually this stands to us as a challenge in the paths that we are following that are not on this board, to choose the paths of justice and righteousness, the paths that ultimately will lead us to heaven and to God and to Jesus. And I think that we will leave things there. We do have a bit of time for questions if there are some, or for further exploration.
Could I just say, when you were talking about the grinding up, the word that immediately came to my mind was so you cannot be remembered.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. The grinding up means that we cannot be remembered. So there's a Remembrance Sunday sermon here as well, Steve, just so that you're looking at this.
Sorry, what?
Remembrance Sunday sermon.
Thank you, yeah. Tony, that'll probably be you. You take notes.
The note is being written as we speak.
How do we know that's Adam and Eve, they're the pair?
I think the flame torch gives Adam and Eve away. So the question just for the video is, how do we know it's Adam and Eve? And we know it's Adam and Eve, I think, because of the flaming sword, or the angel holding the sword.
Oh, right.
But also a male and a female figure at the top right of a picture like this, above hell, but not in hell, is likely to be Adam and Eve.
What does that make that beast beyond them? Satan tempting?
Yeah, it's the roaring lion, I think. It's interesting that with Adam and Eve, it's not depicted as the serpent.
We don't have a serpent, we just have Adam and Eve, but they're on their way out. The serpent's been dealt with by the time they're kicked out of the garden. Yes, I mean, there is that image of Satan as the roaring lion from the letter of Peter. Satan, like a roaring lion, waits to devour you. And I think, again, this is stuck things in just for the fun of it. But yes, that is the direction in which they're heading, isn't it? The other thing that's absent from this is the harrowing of hell, where Jesus goes into hell and brings the souls out. And that's not part of this picture.
You said that there's no purgatory. Is it not debatable that people in the shrouds are suspended and in purgatory?
It is possible that is where purgatory is found in this, but that could equally be the dead waiting for resurrection. And if that's a description of purgatory, I think so. Purgatory is quite certainly in Dante, it's quite an active place where people are being purged of their sins, not just kind of waiting. God alone.
There's not limbo, which is neither.
No. But it could be purgatory. If that's where purgatory fits, then maybe.
I mean, if you take, we are just coming out of the Black Death.
Yeah.
So it's 1400, late 1400 Black Death. So there is a lot of death in this. But at the same token, a few thousand miles south, there is Renaissance in Italy.
Yeah.
Which is, and they economically not very dissimilar. So that devil is present in other, it's not purely the fantasy of the artist in here. So how much of this symbolic was represented throughout the country, and what would a Manbury abbey be like, being this a church attached to Manbury Abbey?
So,
lots of questions.
Lots of questions. I think in terms of the iconography, and it's shared iconography. So you will find this is an intelligible painting here and probably throughout Western Europe. This iconography would be understood. But in any individual instance of it, the thing to do is to look at how the iconography is being deployed in this instance. And here I think we've got some playful iconography around hell. We've got that particular vision of Adam and Eve. We don't have Eve and an apple and a serpent. We've got them being thrown out of the garden. So these are things that can change, that how Jesus in judgment is depicted can change. The rainbow is not an inevitable thing, but it is there and it would be understood because it's there in many, but by no means all. I wouldn't even say most. But all of that iconography would be understood, and it's about how it's deployed here that I think is what makes this painting. That's what we try to do when we're looking and trying to, I suppose, read this particular painting.
And would that be the river, where there would be the river in Agrontis or whatever, or Lethe, or what's the river?
Well, I don't think we've got a river
people
here.
are waiting to be transported.
Yeah, I don't think we've got a river here, but the river is part of the way Dante is deploying the iconography.
Yeah.
In fact, I suspect that Dante gets the river from ancient Greek mythology, more than he gets it from biblical story. So I think Dante's playing a much cleverer game with the iconography that is going on in this Doom Board. This is a much more straightforward depiction than Dante's. But it's but Dante, Milton later, this and many of the kind of medieval paintings of judgment and hell and heaven are all they're kind of playing in the same toy box, but how they play is done differently.
Just on that, how does this compare to the other 4 Doom boards that exist in the UK?
No idea. I have no idea. That's a task for someone.
The iconography, whether it's the Similar or different? Or
I don't know the other Doom boards well enough to give that any kind of an answer. I'm really sorry.
So we have to look at the internet.
Yeah, I think that would be the first port of call. And then, of course, you need to go and make a pilgrimage and see them.
Don't think it hasn't crossed my mind, having done 42 cathedrals. 5 Doom boards will be quite easy.
So, Steve will give you a lift in the capital. Friends, I think we will leave it there. Can I say a huge thank you in his absence again to Christopher for telling us something of the history of it, and a huge thanks to Steve and to all the folk here who look after this. This is a treasure, it's a jewel in the Diocese of